So it's important to remember our motivation for meeting this morning, and for every day we wake up to think, I'm going to try my best to learn and grow, develop my mind in a spiritual understanding, and so that I can be a calmer person, more open-hearted, better listener, and ultimately so that I can free my mind from inner obstacles, actualize my full potential so that I can fully realize all positive qualities and thereby be of highest benefit to all other sentient beings. So last week we talked about the suffering of the lower realms and refuge in the three jewels. After taking refuge, Lama Tsongkhapa gives advice on what to do in order to maintain that. Refuge isn't just a ceremony you do once or some words you recite only in the morning. To actually have refuge, we need to remember our connection with the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha at all times during the day. Some of the ways to do that are to rely on a spiritual teacher with good qualities, to listen and study Dharma teachings in order to familiarize our mind with them, to cultivate faith that we have the ability to attain the qualities of Buddha, train our mind in ethics, concentration, and wisdom, and lastly, seek the companionship of those individuals who live in these practices. After I took refuge, my values began to shift. Over time, I've learned to treasure my Buddhist friends for the support they offer me in living a life devoted to the Buddhist path. Of course, I'm not suggesting that we should abandon caring for old friends who don't share all our values, but it's important to be mindful about how certain people can pull us in unhealthy directions, and be cautious of that until our practice is strong enough not to be influenced by gossip, petty jealousies, choosing sides in a conflict, and so forth. We should also practice restraining our five sense faculties: eye, ear, nose, tongue, and touch perceptions. These are the doorways to the mind. And depending upon what our sense perceptions contact, powerful emotions can trigger the arising of negative states of mind. So it's important to guard these sense doors to avoid creating negative karmic actions. For me, this means spending less time on Facebook, being careful what kind of media, including movies that I watch, having a sense of restraint around food, especially chocolate, and continuing to work on developing patience with all the people and situations that routinely annoy me. Lastly, we should try to cultivate compassion, not just towards our friends and loved ones, but even people we disagree with, people who live in red states, racists, homophobes, misogynists, and politicians who foment violence and who speak lies. This doesn't mean that we condone or forgive any of the harm they create with their actions, but participating in the hatred, which is so endemic in our world, harms our spiritual practice, besides fanning the flames of violence. It is said that one moment of anger can destroy eons of positive karma. If we are ever to build a culture of peace and equity, there must first be a foundation of basic respect for everyone's humanity. People are basically good. However, due to the forces of ignorance, greed, and anger, they commit evil actions at times. The emotional afflictions are only temporary and not an intrinsic part of who we are. They can be removed if we work on ourselves, revealing the mind's fundamental purity. So we're more than halfway through this class series, and I'm realizing that I probably won't be able to cover everything in 11 weeks in the Lam Rim. But it's okay. We can continue in January if there's interest. And I really wanted to dive into these really basic teachings because there's a tendency to just skip over them quickly and dismiss their importance and think that Buddhist meditation is all about sitting on the cushion and getting calm and peaceful. Too often, students, including myself, come to Buddhism with a yearning to go straight for the highest philosophical teachings. We want to receive initiations into tantric deity practices, but we ignore basic practices such as how to behave once one has taken refuge. In doing so, we become kind of like spiritual materialists, grasping the shiniest objects and sneering at boring topics, like being mindful of our anger and attachment. Even after 30 years as a Buddhist, preparing for this class, I realize how I fall into this trap many times every day. There are many other good pieces of advice on how to act after taking refuge in Yangtze Rinpoche's texts. And you can explore those on your own, or we can talk about that. Another good resource is the Pearl of Wisdom, books 1 and 2, which include many prayers and visualizations and short summaries of the Lam Rim, guidelines for the practice of refuge, and other useful topics. So the last topic of the small scope section of the Lam Rim, which focuses on obtaining a fortunate rebirth, is the teaching on karma. Karma is a Sanskrit word that is often translated as action. Karma is complex and often misunderstood. Some people mistakenly think of karma as a form of punishment for negative deeds. So just to review, there is no all-powerful being posited within Buddhism who punishes us when we misbehave. I don't even think that accords with the Christian concept of sin. But in any case, karma is a spiritual law in a similar way that gravity is a physical law of the universe. And while scientists still haven't figured out exactly how gravity works, they have a good working knowledge of its basic principles. When Buddha attained enlightenment through the power of his meditation, he was able to see with clairvoyance that actions of kindness, generosity, patience, understanding, and so forth bring about happy results, and that actions which create harm, such as killing, stealing, speaking harsh words, and so forth, bring about unhappy results. So karma isn't punishment, because if you think about it, punishment implies an inherently existent self who is punished, and an inherently existent creator being who is the punisher, neither of which exist, as is explained in the teachings on emptiness, which I will try to cover towards the end of this series. While karma seems simple on the surface, positive actions bring happiness, harmful actions create suffering, it's not a simple linear equation that we can measure with any of the currently available tools of modern science. In general terms, every action deposits an energetic or spiritual potency in the mind. Depending on the nature of that action, whether it's virtuous or non-virtuous, the intention behind that action, the object of the action, and the completion of the action, the karmic seed which gets deposited in the mental continuum has a corresponding virtuous or non-virtuous potential which then can ripen when the right conditions arise. It may ripen 5 minutes later or 50 lifetimes later. Adding to this puzzle is the fact that Buddhism posits no beginning to the mind. We've all had infinite previous lifetimes, every kind of existence in every realm, from the God realms to the hell realms. By virtue of our being human in this life, it's clear that we already know a lot about karma, because one of the main causes of being born as a human is keeping pure ethical discipline, or performing good karma, in other words. But during our infinite previous lives, we were planting karmic seeds in every moment. And if you ever have worked in a garden, you know that seeds are ripening all the time. Most of them are weeds in my garden, but if we tend a garden carefully, we can grow beautiful flowers and delicious food. Karmic action is of three types: physical, verbal, and mental. We create karma with our body, our speech, and with our thoughts and our intentions. So probably you have a lot of questions about karma, and it's important to frame the teaching on karma carefully so that we maintain a balanced practice. Buddha outlined 4 subjects called imponderables, and karma is one of them, which means that if we try to understand the intricate causality behind every single karmic outcome, we'll tie our mind in knots and waste precious time engaged in fruitless metaphysical speculation. In one of the sutras or teachings from the Buddha's life, the parable of the arrow is told. A man approaches the Buddha and demands to know the answers to a range of questions about life after death, the nature of the cosmos, and so forth. Initially, the Buddha replies with silence, which was the first hint that these topics aren't helpful for our spiritual development. But the man persists. So Buddha replied with a hypothetical story of a man shot by an arrow who then refuses an offer of help from someone coming to his aid. As he is lying there, mortally wounded, he tells the bystander that before you pull out the arrow, he wants to know who shot the arrow, what kind of wood the shaft is made from, whether he used a longbow or a crossbow, the type of bird feather used on the arrow, and several other trivial details. The point Buddha is making here is not to waste our time trying to answer irrelevant questions to our fundamental problem, which is that life is short and death is coming. The arrow is a metaphor for ignorance. We should immediately pull the arrow out before we die without having practiced the Dharma. Karma is a topic that requires a degree of faith that Buddha told the truth. Otherwise, we could end up unconsciously embracing nihilism, saying that nothing matters and that it doesn't matter if we take care of the earth. Someone's coming to save us, so we can just ignore ethics and do whatever we want. This is quite dangerous. When I was in my 20s, I didn't consciously embrace nihilism, but there was a trend among my peers just to always act like everything was cool and downplay any sense of personal responsibility for larger issues affecting our world. But back to the parable of the arrow. I'm not saying that it's not beneficial to learn about the general characteristics of karma, but we need to have a balanced practice and try to be mindful so we don't get caught up in distractions from our goal, which is higher rebirth, liberation, and enlightenment. This is sometimes difficult to hear for new students. We can get very tense and tight, holding on to ideas of being perfect practitioners, doing our morning and evening prayers and meditation, never having a non-virtuous thought, always focused and mindful of the Dharma. This rigid approach to practice only leads to discouragement when we fail to meet the unrealistic expectations of ourselves. It's just like the breathing meditation. When we space out and drift off our focus on the breath, we remember and come back to it. letting go of the distraction, being gentle with ourselves, and pick up the practice again. Okay, back to karma. There are 4 main characteristics of karma. Karma is definite. Karma increases. Karmic results don't happen unless we've created the cause. And lastly, karma, once created, does not disappear. So let's look at each one of these a little bit more. Karma is definite. All happiness arises from virtue, and all suffering arises from non-virtue. Happiness never results from non-virtuous action, and suffering never results from virtuous action. Second, karma increases or multiplies. To use an example here, one of the largest living things on the planet is a giant sequoia tree. Yet the seed for this tree is very tiny, only a few millimeters long. The different texts I've read don't offer a clear explanation of precisely why karma increases, but a few of the sutras provide clues. One way that karma multiplies is by the power of the object or recipient of the action. For example, there's a story about someone with a very pure motivation. They give a few pennies to the Buddha. And in a future life, it is said that that person experienced great wealth from that action based on the power of the object and the power of their strong intention. Another way that karma increases is if we habitually perform some action again and again. And of course, we're all creatures of habit, or at least I am. So these small actions by themselves, they don't have powerful force alone, but by the power of repeating that action again and again over time, one of those seeds could ripen with the cumulative momentum of many such small acts, causing the karma to effectively multiply. The third characteristic of karma is that if an action is not performed, the result will not be met. If we don't create the causes to transform our mind by studying the Dharma, thinking and meditating, then we can't expect to develop the spiritual realizations leading to liberation and enlightenment. By the same token, if we abstain from harming others, we won't create the causes for suffering. Of course, there's always a lag time between the karma we create and the karma that we experience. And so, you see people who might be rich and famous and they're doing a lot of evil actions, and we sort of question, does karma really work? But what's happening is that person's karma, they're exhausting all their virtuous karma from previous lives and creating lots of non-virtuous karma for the future. The fourth and last general characteristic is that karma is never lost. If an action is committed, it will ripen and bear fruit, even if it takes 1,000,000 eons, it's said. However, there is one exception to this rule, and that is that karmic seeds can be weakened. For example, if we do strong purification practice in relationship to negative actions we've created, using the 4 opponent powers, one can neutralize non-virtuous karmic seeds so that they ripen with a much weaker effect or possibly not at all. So I'll talk about purification next week, but in brief, the 4 opponent powers are regret, restoring the relationship, the determination not to repeat that action, and remedial virtuous actions. And the most important of those 4 is a strong sense of regret, which is different from guilt, but we'll talk more about it next week. The primary method by which we integrate the teachings of karma into our practice as Buddhists is by avoiding the 10 negative karmic actions and practicing their opposites, the 10 virtuous actions. In terms of the actions to avoid, there are 3 physical actions: killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct; 4 verbal actions: lying, harsh words, divisive speech, and idle talk; and 3 mental actions: covetousness, malice, and wrong views. So there's really a lot to say about all of these, but here's just a few comments. Killing is the most harmful action, and there's many gradations, with the worst being intentional killing of human life. However, killing animals is also considered non-virtuous, particularly killing done out of a sense of sport and without any survival imperative. Transitioning to a vegetarian or vegan diet is most aligned with keeping this precept purely, and fish and chicken are also sentient beings, although you wouldn't necessarily learn that by observing the conditions in industrial farms. Stealing traditionally refers to taking anything not freely given, which in ancient times referred mostly to physical objects like gold, silver, or land, but today could include things like white-collar crimes of embezzlement, tax fraud, borrowing resources from our workplace with no intention of returning them. So as I was going through this list, I started thinking about how this brings up a lot of interesting questions about modern ethics, and particularly related to land ownership. Do humans really own land, or is land ownership just a convenient anthropocentric justification for human greed, a kind of manifest destiny proclamation towards nature, similar to the 15th century papal decree giving Christian armies the right to conquer and annex any land considered to be inhabited by heathens? Certainly, it is legal for a timber company to clear cut a forest that they hold title to. But from another point of view, did anyone ask permission of the countless species of animals and birds that lived in the forest, who instantly become homeless and potentially extinct as a result? There's a heartbreaking video of an orangutan defending its home from giant machinery in one of the last trees in an otherwise decimated forest being clear cut for palm oil in Indonesia, I think. By the same token, is war ever ethical? The legality or widespread social acceptance of an action doesn't necessarily imply that it is ethical or virtuous. We have to think very carefully today regarding our impact as humans and how our modern lifestyle, especially here in the US, is collectively responsible for so much destruction to the web of life on the planet, and the karmic implications that our participation in that system entails. Regarding the non-virtue of sexual misconduct, there are some outdated interpretations of sexual morality that are clearly biased towards heterosexual values if one reads older source texts in Buddhism. Sexuality is a powerful energy that requires mindfulness in order not to harm others, either through breaking trust, being careful about spreading sexual disease, or not taking responsibility for the possibility of creating new life. We live in a pluralistic society where there are many different ways of living, and it's important not to rigidly attempt to impose one's own version of morality on others. Being mindful of not harming others is the main logic behind the 10 non-virtues. When it comes to sexuality, though, it's important to remember, as I stated earlier, that nowhere in Buddhism is there an idea of judgment or punishment. These guidelines are simply advice from the Buddha for our practice, which is based on the understanding that we live in the desire realm, And the principal obstacle or enemy to our spiritual progress is the mind of unrestrained desire, greed, and attachment. Our ego is programmed to seek pleasant stimuli from the five senses, which is logical and healthy from a survival perspective, but we often don't know when to quit. So let's stop here and talk about anything that came up for you, either in your meditation in the last week or any questions you have from the talk about karma, any challenges or successes integrating the Dharma into your daily life. And remember, there's no such thing as a irrelevant question or dumb question. It's always helpful to everybody to have discussion. So
I think having compassion for those we disagree with, I struggle with, especially probably family. And that's probably where I need to exercise it most. But I guess I'm just trying to find a good anchor or habit, if it's in refuge, or I guess how to reframe it in a more spiritual way versus like in the moment that it's happening, like that the disagreements are happening, or the feelings are coming up, where you feel like the person is the other. No question, I guess just reflection on that piece.
yeah, I mean, it's really difficult to master these things in the moment that we're practicing, and that's I find it useful to review the day at the end of the day when I'm alone and I'm less likely to be reactive. I'm just, okay, I'm just with myself now. I can be honest and open and just review, okay, how did I handle that situation? Oh yeah, I got impatient and angry with my father. He really pulls my chain, yeah, but still it's not helpful for me to react that way. And just renew my intention to think about all the different ways that I can respond in the future that keep my anger in check and help me be more patient. And
the thing with karma with me is, I guess, I mean, I think that's the, I've heard many times that, Buddhism is not, there is no God in Buddhism, that really sort of karma is the representation of a God. That I put a lot of belief into that, just sort of over the four laws that you were talking about. The forgiveness has been something that has been on my mind this week. It was just sort of brought up, and it was, I related it to family too, like Shane was talking about, and just the people that kind of come in and out of our lives, why is it, family, why do we sort of brush up against one another. I certainly do that with my sisters. They've been kind of driving me crazy this week. I just, for me, it just gives me an opportunity to think, well, why, when something that they do angers me, it's like, what is it about that, what's the underlying thing that is being stirred up there? And usually it means I relate. I mean, typically what I find is that I have the very same behavior, it's just, I don't see it, or, it wouldn't upset me if it wasn't there, or if it wasn't so close to me. And that, and just, the fact that how do people come in and out of our lives? Like, I took this one class when I was with a Buddhist group down in California. Ami brought a lady who, she's brilliant, Sujatha. I think she's kind of involved with FPMT somewhat, Sujatha Baliga, but she her work is around restorative justice, and just she mediates for people. Like she'll mediate between somebody that's a victim of crime with the person, the perpetrator, and the process of that. And it just makes me, yeah, how do these people, like, because I think it's karma that's kind of running all of that, what it just gets so involved, when you think of that. How did this murderer come into this mother's life to kill her child? And the karmic laws that are behind that.
Couple things. Be careful not to get into that sort of imponderable aspect of karma. Instead of asking the question, why is this person coming into my life? What am I feeling right now? And is it a positive state of mind that I want to keep or not? Just kind of keep it really simple. And I'm along the same lines. I remember with classes with one of my teachers, Venerable Children, she would often make this point that how do I say this in the right way? Psychotherapy is definitely a useful medical system. And Mark can share more about this, I'm sure, because he's a psychotherapist. But it's important to recognize that we've all had infinite childhoods and we've all been related in many different ways. And so not to overanalyze that and just recognize that the primary goal isn't to figure out, what aspect of my childhood was out of balance, or, why my father yelled at me and terrorized me, but to look very practically, what is this arrow that's impaling my spiritual progress right now, and how do I pull it out? So, Mark, maybe you can comment on that more gracefully than I just did.
Yeah, from a psychological viewpoint, we look at things a little bit differently. Look back at generations and see how particular problems will come up through the generations. Intergenerational issues like intergenerational trauma are being studied more, but of course that's kind of a very different slant on the topic than karma, because I know each individual has their own karma, as opposed to, I don't take on the karma of my father necessarily, but tricky to draw direct analogies between the two.
I have a question for you. What would you say is the main difference between using psychotherapy as a healing modality versus, maybe you even have some client who wants to understand Buddhist psychology, which is, kind of a different layer of investigation. And, I guess the main question is, what is the difference between psychotherapy versus the Lam Rim, basically, trying to use that framework to heal once and for all.
Yeah, certainly as a Buddhist, my goal is to try and improve myself for the benefit of all sentient beings. And since, obviously I adhere to a Buddhist viewpoint, I think Buddhist techniques are really important. And as a therapist, I encourage people to use those. I talk about emotions, and I talk about learning to sit with your emotions rather than act on them. And so I incorporate a lot of Buddhist techniques into my practice, but I separate out the bigger picture, like I never really talk about karma or things like that, which, you know, as a Buddhist, my hope is that what we do can benefit all sentient beings. And yeah, that's not a tack that I present in therapy, of course.
So maybe a good distinction, a fair way to put it is that psychotherapy is focused on healing this one life versus healing healing our internmentship in samsara.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and it's, at least as I presented, it's more of an individual focus rather than on a focus of all humanity like Buddhism is. You know, our hope is that we can benefit. Of course, as you know, we benefit everyone, not just ourselves with our practice. But I would be interested in hearing more about, you know, I guess one of the things that I find a little bit disturbing, frankly, is how my negative actions might destroy any positive karma that I develop through doing good deeds. Yeah, that's a little kind of mysterious to me.
Well, I think the most important moment of our life from a Buddhist perspective is the moment we die, because the moment we die, whatever karma ripens in that moment determines the throwing karma, the karma that basically projects us into the next life, determines what realm we'll be born into. It's important that that's a virtuous thought. And the more that we create virtuous thoughts, the more habituated we'll be to those, so that it's less likely have some moment of fear or anger, but more likely just to think about bodhicitta, altruism, love, compassion. Because I mean, this is all stuff that's beyond my direct awareness. I'm just sharing what I've read. I don't know that it works this way, but you know, if you're born in the lower realms, it's very difficult to get out of them. It takes a long time to practice dharma. If you're born into a situation where there's a lot of suffering, you know, it's said that, I mean, the traditional teachings are a little bit fire and brimstone-y around this topic of, like, you know, we should really fear death while we're alive, but once if we practice well, once we come to the moment of death, then we shouldn't be afraid. We should feel confident, and if you really practice well, death can be a really joyful experience. I think it was Ram Dass or somebody said it's like taking off a shoe. Taking off a tight shoe. That's a good question. I would ask Rinpoche next time you see him.
I myself try to always focus on the positive. I grew up Catholic, and it's like guilt. Guilt is a huge thing with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I took my Pratimoksha vows, I just, instead of writing the non-virtuous actions, I write the virtuous actions. And I try, because it does, yeah, like Jordan was saying, does kind of come down as fire and brimstone-y, you know, that you're erasing eons and eons. So I try to hear, but it also creates eons and eons if you do something good. You know, those are the things that I try to keep my mind on.
Yeah, I'll definitely cover the positive virtues next week. And one other thing, you know, like if you see somebody doing something really good, especially if it's a holy being, you know, somebody with a high realization like the Dalai Lama or something, and you rejoice in their actions, you know, all the good works they're doing, that creates mountains of karma, mountains of positive karma. So it's good to rejoice in the good virtues of others. This is considered the easiest way to create positive karma, is rejoicing in others' merits.
Is our life a result of another being's karmic action or not? I mean, I guess I'm just thinking very broadly for humans, but I don't think that's true, but maybe you could fill in more color to that.
Did you ask, is our life the result of another person's karma?
Another being's karmic
Oh.
action.
Oh, so I think I get what you're asking is what is the nature of the mind stream that goes from one life to the next, kind of.
Right.
And that gets into the whole question of emptiness and what is the nature of the self. And to make it really short and succinct, there's one mental continuum that has beginningless origin, and eventually it will attain enlightenment and continue on as an enlightened being. So that's your previous life. You know, you could have been could have been anything. You could have been born in any realm, and obviously you didn't have the same name back then. But it's the same mental continuum that and yeah, continuum is it's not an identity per se. It's like a river, you know. The river keeps flowing from the mountains down to the ocean, and keeps flowing and keeps flowing, and you can't actually look at the river and point at any one drop in the river and say, well, that's the river. But it is, you know, by virtue of kind of conceptual agreements, and you know, everybody agrees that's the river. It's merely labeled. So it's the same with the nature of the self. It's a merely labeled mind stream. But if you look for that mind stream, you can't actually find anything and point to it. So that's the deepest form of wisdom that we're trying to realize, not just intellectually, but directly. And we have to have good ethics and concentration in order to develop the mind to such a state and level of calmness and focus that we can perceive that really clearly. So, excellent question. So let's just do a short dedication. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the enlightened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi not yet born rise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forever. Nice to see you all. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you.